Pauls is with us today. So excited to have Dr. John Pauls with us today. And he is actually he's really specialty is autism spectrum disorder, special education. He actually got his how long ago did you get your PhD, Dr.?
It was an EdD and I got it just in January. So I just finished 7 years of intensive writing.
and you have a son with autism, so that had to be near and dear to your heart. Yes.
Absolutely. Autism impacts 1 in 44 individuals now in the United States. Those are the latest numbers. And so it's really important that we discuss not only autism, but how we make inclusive spaces and practices for everybody, because it's not going away anytime soon.
No. And so we are super excited here to learn about hidden potential, using technology to create inclusive spaces and practices. If you have questions, drop them into the chat and I will be asking them of Dr. John soon. So Dr. John, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Thank you all for joining me today. This is a really important topic in my mind. I think that we have such diverse talent in our classrooms that we need to find a way to really leverage that. So I'm so excited to be talking about the hidden potential of using technology to create inclusive spaces and practices. Now, before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. John Pauls. When I was in the K-12 space, I taught students with autism spectrum disorder in a self-contained setting. And so they received instruction from me and everything. And then when I adopted my son who has autism, I realized I could not do it all 24/7 anymore. So I went to the district level in instructional technology. And my research interest is really about how do we as practitioners use technology to not only engage our learners, but to include our learners. And what I find time and time again is that some people just don't even know what's possible. And so it is my job to really make sure that we can expose how we can kind of make an inclusive space so that all students are welcome. You are welcome to follow me at Dr. John Pauls on Twitter. I have a YouTube channel as well. And my joy is just getting the message of inclusivity and accessibility out there to everybody. And so please follow along if you would like to do that. Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusion. So we're going to start by understanding inclusion. Then we're going to go to barriers to inclusivity. So what does the literature say stops us from creating inclusive environments? We'll talk about the importance of inclusive learning spaces. We'll look a little bit at what inclusion could look like in your practices, and then we're going to prepare for takeoff. So throughout this presentation, I am going to ask anybody who is watching in this community to either tweet out or post on your social networks using hashtag IMNCCE, hashtag NCCE Live, and you can even mention me at Dr. John Pauls, because this is a two-way conversation. Even though we are not in the same space, everybody has a voice. So please tweet out your response to this question. So what does the word inclusion mean to you? I think it's really important that we all get on the same page on what do we think inclusion looks like. So I'll give you a couple seconds to tweet that out or post that. And we'll look at some scholarly definitions of inclusion. So according to the University of North Carolina, the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, understanding inclusion, that is taking into account all children's social, cultural, and linguistic diversity in curriculum decision-making processes. So what this means to me is that every child should have an opportunity to demonstrate their learning in a way that is authentic to them. Everybody in your classroom should have recognized experiences that honor their life in your classroom. And everybody should have equitable access to your resources and participation in your classrooms. Now, this is what it would look like to have students come in and be welcome in your class. But we know that we may not be comfortable with inclusive practices. We may have some barriers to that. And so I do want to recognize that in just a bit. What I'm going to go through right now is a little game. You can answer in your head. You can tweet it out if you want to, but this is just to kind of get us in the right frame of mind for this discussion. So let's play, is it inclusive? So the first one, only using one form of response options for assessment and learning. Now, I see this all the time in the higher education space, and it may or may not be one of my pet peeves. But if I only use multiple choice questions for my assessments or assignments, I am not really being inclusive, because I am sure that there are individuals who may not respond to that multiple choice prompt. I talk to people all the time about the actual construction of text. So if in your class, say you're teaching chemistry and you have them write a paper, right? I always tell people, are you teaching writing comprehension, or are you teaching something else? Because if writing comprehension is not core to what you're teaching as a subject expert, why can't we bring in some alternative methods of response and presentation? We have gotten so stuck into a writing text-based experience in schools. We do this because it's easy to track. We can track all these multiple choice questions, but I challenge us that we really need to look at how our students respond to instruction and ask yourself the question, can all students have an equitable chance to respond to instruction based on how I am using that? So maybe instead of a multiple choice question or maybe an essay, maybe you do a Microsoft Flip topic where students can verbally discuss their concepts, and you can still get that data. It's just maybe in a way that they find more manageable based on their lives and experiences. Yeah, there we go. So no, it's not really inclusive. Instructional materials that do not contain diverse voices. I also challenge you all to go into your school libraries, your classroom libraries, your worksheets. Look at them. And do you have the students in your class, are they reflected in your instructional materials? So I'm talking about books that you may have. Do you have diverse voices and choices in your posters in your classroom? Do you have representation of the students who live in your space? If you are creating assessment activities, do those assessments take into account the diverse voices of your students? And so it's not really inclusive just to stick with one kind of instructional material, one kind of book. Our students have a right to see themselves in all spaces, and if they do not, it's harder for them to imagine what's possible in their lives. So I encourage you, look at those instructional materials, and if they're not diverse enough or accessible for students, get with me. You can text me, or you can message me on Twitter. We can find a way to make it inclusive. You must be in class to receive instruction. Now, I know this is different for K through 12 space. I'm in higher education currently, so I understand, but I really do not understand teachers who may be like, you are out of class, you can't do this. With things like Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, learning management systems, blended learning tools, your students can receive instruction anywhere across the globe, anywhere. You know, we're not talking about, is it effective instruction? We're not getting into that. But the point is, with these tools, you can literally learn everywhere. I may or may not have engaged in a professional development session using Nearpod while I was driving. I was listening to it through my radio. And so if you use technology, you can receive instruction anywhere, which means students can access it anywhere. And it's a little bit more inclusive of their lived experiences. Because your students, especially if you're in high school, they're probably working jobs. And so I like to think that creating accessible and inclusive learning opportunities is not about perfection, but about a constant awareness to the evolving needs of our students and having a toolbox full of ideas to help you welcome all authentically. Now, the reason I put this on here is I've heard time and time again, especially in the higher education space, when I talk about inclusivity or accessibility, the alarms start going off with the professors. They're like, oh my gosh, I need to have alt text. I need to have this color. I need to do this. I need to do this. There are inclusive practices that you can find online that meet so many different requirements. But I challenge you to not get overwhelmed by the scope. You can't meet everybody's needs in the entire school, but meet your students' needs. If you have a student who may have a vision impairment, maybe we teach them about magnification or immersive reader from Microsoft. If you have other students who may need some considerations, focus on your class and teaching them those skills, and then that will transfer to other classes in the school system. So again, it's all about evolving to meet our students' needs. Now let's talk a little bit about barriers to inclusivity. Now, according to UNC Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, you can actually scan this if you need to access this data. I encourage you to do so. There can be 3 barriers to inclusivity, especially in the classroom, and that is personal barrier, attitudinal barrier, and organizational barriers. Now, personal barriers may look like somebody in the classroom who is threatened by change to practice. Maybe they learned how to teach at a certain time in their life and they do not feel comfortable going outside of their comfort zone. They may view themselves as not having the needed skills to teach students with diverse learning strategies, and they may dislike working with others. They may have additional demands on their time and skills. So when we look at our teachers that we're coaching, when we look at how we discuss these things, we need to recognize that some individuals may have personal barriers that we need to break through in order to get the message out there. There is also an attitudinal barrier. There are some people who believe that inclusion may be a detriment to children without disabilities. These people may generalize or label children and families, and we may have slight unconscious bias or prejudices or ignorance about different cultures. And that's not a bad thing, friends. We just have to make sure that we are constantly evolving ourselves, being open to the dialogue, and understanding that, diversity and inclusion makes our world a much brighter place. And so if you find that maybe you have an attitudinal barrier, I encourage you to reach out with some friends in your school or reach out to your professional learning community and talk about those. Now, one of the biggest barriers that you'll probably see, especially in K through 12 space, is the organizational barrier. So this is, as a school district, we don't have the funds for inclusive programming. We don't have professional development to teach individuals inclusive programming. We don't have the resources. It's difficult to retain and recruit staff. There's a lack of commitment by leaders or school-based staff to inclusive practice. This is evident in the latest ChatGPT dialogue, right? If you're unfamiliar, ChatGPT is a large language model that can be used to generate answers to your prompts in a pretty fascinating way. But out of all of the dialogue I've seen from individuals saying, oh, this is going to lead to plagiarism, this is going to lead to X, Y, and Z, never once saw anybody say, wow, look at how this could be used for my students with additional needs and learning considerations. So we need to understand that if we're not kind of being out there and putting inclusion as an intentional part of our practice, there are barriers that could keep us from actually fostering those inclusive environments. Now, if you want to break through those barriers, you need knowledge and you need to be flexible. Nothing should be rigid. Nothing should be rigid. Be flexible. Go with the flow, because nothing in teaching actually works the way you want it to, right? And again, you can scan that QR code for additional information from the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. So we need to work on gaining knowledge and flexibility. So how do we do that? So my second community question for all of you, again, please tweet out or post it with hashtag IMNCCE and @mentionme. But as a coach or teacher, what barriers to inclusivity do you see and how will you overcome them? So as a coach or teacher, what barriers to inclusivity do you see and how will you overcome them? So make sure to tweet that out, mention us so we can see the dialogue, because how I view inclusivity in my practices is going to probably be different than yours, because we are all unique people. And that doesn't mean that anybody's wrong. We just need to talk about how we do things so we can get more ideas and a more inclusive learning space. So let's talk a bit about the importance. We talked about barriers, but John, why is it important to be inclusive? Well, I think we know the answer, but let's put some data to this. In 2020 to 2021, the number of students ages 3 through 21 who receive special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was 7.2 million, or 15% of all public school students. The graphic you see in front of you is a depiction. If you had this class of students or this many students in your class, statistically, you are more likely to have 4 individuals who fall under IDEA who need additional supports, whether it's a 504 plan or an IEP, interventions. Everybody is going to be impacted by that. When we look at the percentage of individuals served under IDEA, we have 30% of that have a specific learning disability. This could very, very broad demographics of that, right? We have speech and language impairment, other health impairment, autism, developmental delay, intellectual disability. And so we see how many people are served and the actual need in our schools, right? So in order for all of our students to learn and to achieve their learning outcomes that are needed to be successful in society, we need to make sure that they can actually digest the content. So our students are there. This one is really important to me. So when you look at this graph, among school-age students served under IDEA, the percentage who spend the various amounts of time inside general education classes. So this is fall 2009 through fall 2020. And if you see there, 60% of students who are identified as having a disability or learning consideration from IDEA spend 80% or more of their time inside a general education class. So 60% of those students spend 80% of their time or more inside gen ed. And so I challenge you to think about when students who have an IEP or a 504 plan, when they come into your space, how are we including them? How are we still maintaining their needs for instruction based on their individual learning considerations? So it's really important whether you teach special education, exceptional student education, whether you teach general education, whether you teach art, music, PE, you will have students who have very unique learning considerations based on an identified disability. And so you need to ask yourself, am I giving them just as much of a chance to learn as my non-disabled peers, right? And so that data is there to really discuss this. Now, my dissertation that Tammy was discussing, I actually launched the day that we went remote for the pandemic. And so it was a horrendous time, but we made it through. But I looked at how individuals in a public school education teach students with autism. Now, I know this is inclusivity about everybody, but as autism impacts 1 in 44 individuals, and it's so close to my heart, that's what I focused on. And what was really interesting, and I put this excerpt from my dissertation on there, according to this survey, only students who had dual special education training felt competent or prepared to educate students with ASD. Now, I don't have data on what I'm about to say, but it would be interesting to look. But I would probably bet that the individuals with autism, maybe individuals with Down syndrome or dyslexia or other considerations, I'm willing to bet they didn't have instruction in that as well. It'd be a great thing to look at in future research studies. But if our teachers, especially in gen ed, are not exposed to how to create inclusive learning spaces, how are we servicing this large chunk of individuals coming into your room? And so that is something that we all really need to work on and analyze and recognize. So my next community question is this: as an educational professional, how do you feel we as a society are doing in creating more inclusive learning spaces? So how are we doing? How are you doing in your school district? And maybe your school district has some amazing things going on. Maybe you're doing something really, really fun. Share with your community so that everybody is aware of what is possible. I will say I did not put a slide in this, but you can actually follow them at DCPS Ultra on Twitter. I started developing a grant for our school district that was actually awarded right before I left the school district, and it's called Ultra, Utilizing and Leveraging Technology to Rethink Accessibility. And these teachers in this school district get instruction in Microsoft accessibility tools and Minecraft, and they get coaching from our Ultra specialist. And we are trying to figure out, does using Minecraft or technology like Minecraft impact students who have a disability in the areas of STEM performance? And I will tell you, as somebody who spent the last 6-7 years researching in this space, there's not a lot of information. There's not a lot of information. And so there is a need to really expand our thoughts so that we can get that data, so that we can create truly inclusive learning spaces. So go ahead and tweet this out. Let us know what you're doing so that we might get some ideas and some inspiration. So inclusion may look like this: variety of presentation and response options. So maybe my students can pick, do you want to, write a 1-paragraph paper? Do you want to respond to a flip video discussion? Or do you want to demonstrate your learning in a Minecraft world where you can show me the process that you are working with? It is my practice. I try to give us several response options if I can, just because I know giving that power to the students honors their experience. So make sure we're using a variety of presentation options: video, audio, people doing podcasts, text-based instruction, right? We are moving into a world, especially with things like AI, where creativity is really going to be important. So how can you get students to demonstrate their learning in a way that is not just sticking to text, right? So maybe we have a flip video, maybe we do a podcast, maybe you also supplement with some text-based paper prompts or discussion board prompt. It's there, and I'm not saying you have to remove all of the text-based, but I think that in order to be inclusive, let's give students a variety of options that they can use in your course to demonstrate mastery of the concepts. Now, I'm also a big believer in student representation in instructional materials. Tammy and I were discussing before we went live about my slide decks. My creation is incredibly important to me because it's a way that I can really just honor my own spirit. And I know that my students are the same. I have had students who have been silent all semester When I ask them to be creative, when I ask them to show me what they know, I get the engagement. So often we say, this is how it needs to be done, and this is how we're going to do it. But if we let down some of those parameters and let our students rise to the experience of learning in your class, you'll see some really amazing things. And your students should see themselves in your class at all times. What I mean by that? This right here is, and I'm not going to start it, but my son, Luke, he has autism. And so I'm always working on finding ways to make his life more inclusive, accessible, and to make sure that he has a high quality of life. And he loves YouTube videos. He loves them. He watches and he learns from YouTube videos. And I have recognized that for my son, visuals and video is what's going to connect with him. So I made him his own YouTube channel where I could get the skills that he needs to master, put them in a nice package that is uniquely his, and maybe other people will like it as well.
Welcome to Lukey's Clubhouse. Do you know the months of the year? Let's practice.
And by featuring
Ready? Let's do
his AAC device right here, this is an augmentative and alternative communication. This is what some individuals who are non-speaking may use to communicate. My son uses this as well. And so by me bringing in that content for my son, showing his life in a YouTube video that he created, I think is incredibly powerful. I think it's powerful to have all students see themselves not as the odd man out, but, oh yeah, AAC devices, those are totally normal. I've seen them on YouTube. It opens the dialogue. We need to really kind of have fun when it comes to creating for our students. This is another example. I realized that, there's really not a lot of autism-focused children's books out there. Not that I found, there may be. But if you go to our school libraries, if you go to our classroom libraries, you probably don't have any text from the vantage point of an individual with autism, right? And so I said, well, I could do something about that. So I made him a little book, Live Like Lukey. I made this all in Canva. All of it's in Canva. There's a character builder that you can use to create a book. But me doing this allowed for my son's story to be a part of his legacy. You'll see we have his iPad for his communication. Something like this allows all of our students to be seen. And so if you look in your instructional materials and you don't have diversity of thought, of expression, any of that stuff, you can adapt that using something like Canva. Number 3, I want you to try new things. This is actually a video of my son. He was having a very, very difficult time one day with emotional regulation. And so I said, let me see if this will help. So I got out my Meta device and I got him into a Santa Claus roller coaster and I put the headset on him and I got on my phone so I could see literally through his eyes. And I'm able to look as he looks to the right, as he looks to the left. I'm able to see what is grabbing your attention. Is it the colors? Is it the houses? Where are you focusing? And so for a child who does not speak, it is really important that I can kind of get an insight into his lived experience. And so while I know things like VR are cost prohibitive for a lot of people, and it may not be in specific classrooms, there is a place for this technology. We just have to get there so that we can find the ways to use it efficiently. And I talked about ChatGPT earlier, about how we can use this information to help us make things more inclusive, right? So if I had a student who was not understanding my topic, was not understanding how I was presenting the information, I can ask ChatGPT something like, explain this concept to me like I am a kindergartner. And it will take that information and it will synthesize it in a way that is uniquely relevant to you. Now, you, as with any tool, you need to verify that it's correct. You need to verify that it's real. All of those digital citizenship qualities that we use. But think about how ChatGPT could be used to make learning actually accessible and inclusive for our students who may not be able to interact with a PowerPoint presentation or Excel presentation, but now with these embedded items with AI, you don't know where that's going to go. And so when we do have these technology innovations, I do encourage everybody to include individuals with disabilities or considerations in that dialogue, because while it may not be pertinent for you, it could be life-changing for them. And so when I think about that, I think about how can I use this to make your experience more authentic, more lived, more genuine. And familiarize yourself with available accessible features of your favorite tools. If you scan this on my screen, I believe we have that in our chat, or we will be putting that in here. I have a Canva doc that has Microsoft Learning Tools, Google Learning Tools, Canva Learning Tools with some videos and some ways for you to go and explore using these in your practices. So we will put that in the chat and then you can scan this, but I am going to go ahead and move on real quick. So our next community question, what inclusive tools do you use and how does it impact your instruction? Let us know. What inclusive tools do you use and how does it impact your instruction? So we've talked about understanding inclusion, barriers to inclusivity, importance of inclusive learning spaces. We've seen a little bit what inclusion could look like. Now we prepare for takeoff. You cannot change the world by not including the world, right? Change the world by including the world. And if you at any time need any help with this, there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to inclusivity in the classroom. People will tell you that there is, but there's not. It is intentional effort. It is mastery of the tools that you have access to and how they can be leveraged for your students. And if you have any issues with that, I am an NCCE professional learning specialist as well. You can contact, your district can contact NCCE, and we can get training and development for your districts. If you want one-on-one personalized, please connect on either YouTube at Dr. John Pauls or at Innovation Weekly, and on Twitter at Dr. John Pauls as well. There are so many resources out there, and you are not faulted because you do not know every tool or trick. We can't know it all. But I think the effort, that is what we will use going forward. So again, at any time, if you want to reach out with any of us, we'd be more than happy to help you create more inclusive practices. So I really do appreciate everybody coming out. I'm going to hand it back to Tammy. And I appreciate the space to discuss this really important topic with all of you.
We really appreciate it. I love the point of view that we don't sometimes think of how technology can impact others, especially people outside of our sphere. And so that was like my aha moment when you were talking. We really don't, I always tell my students, you don't know someone until you've walked a mile in their footsteps, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about with your inclusivity. We don't know the journeys. That also made me think of the importance of creating a community in your classroom where students are comfortable enough to tell you, what they need. I have a student this year who spoke up and said, "Oh, Mrs. Dunbar, I'm sorry, it's Ramadan. I can't have anything to eat in class." I'm like, "Oh, tell us about that," and for them not to be afraid to talk and for us to say, teach us and give them a platform, right? And I also, on a personal note, wanted to thank you because a friend of mine from the HP Teaching Fellows has a son with autism, and he's excited to go see the Super Mario's movie.
Yes.
Tell the audience about that. That was just I was like, I had no clue that was even available.
Yes, so that was a really good point, and this is why we speak of these things, especially in a social aspect, so we can learn. But when it comes to individuals with autism or any sort of disability who may need additional accommodations, right? You can go, AMC Theaters has this, and I believe other theaters do, but they have a sensory awareness showings for students, especially or individuals with autism, where the noise is lowered, the lights are a little bit, they're turned on, it's not so dark, and it's more of an inclusive space for individuals who have autism or other disabilities to get together and enjoy a movie that just came out. And I will tell you, as a father, I don't get a chance to go out to movies too often. I don't get a chance to really experience life as other people do because I have a son who has needs that needs to be met. And so I'm always thinking about how, when I go to this space, how am I going to interact? How are we going to be inclusive? Whether it's going to Disney World and Universal, we get accessibility passes so that he doesn't have to wait in line for this period of time before he gets on a ride because he can't do that. So it's all about, don't be afraid to ask the question. For any company, if you want to see a movie, ask them, do you offer sensory screenings? Because it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. So start opening your eyes to where the inclusivity is already being established in our world, and then share it with your friends. That's that. And I'll tell you, when you tagged me on Twitter with your friend asking about that, that was probably my biggest thing for the week. I was so happy. It wasn't about teaching, but it was like, I just told him something that he can go and do, and now he can go enjoy this movie with his son, father-son bonding in a way that's authentic to them. That's all that matters to me. I want you, any individual, to live their life and love it and get every opportunity. So being able to share that, fantastic.
Yeah. And not being afraid to ask questions and fail, right? Fail fabulously. It's the effort, as you said, it's making that effort to try to include everyone and do your best, even if you fail, right?
Well, and you're never going to be perfect. I will tell you this little story. I was teaching computer science and I had this student there in higher education, and I had a student who was sitting at the back of the class all semester. And one day I was roaming around, I was teaching, and I looked, and he's from another country, and he was using translation services. And I said, John, why didn't you do more to, like, I could have embedded that in my PowerPoint. I could have taken the step as a teacher to make it more accessible for him, but I wasn't aware. And that's going to be okay. You're not always going to be aware of things. It's what you do after that awareness that matters. And so then I was able to have a conversation with them. I apologized. I'm like, we can make this more engaging for you. Let's do that. And so that's what I did. But it's really easy to kind of, if you're not intentionally looking for those opportunities, it's really hard to miss them.
This is so inspirational. And yes, Dr. John is an NCCE professional learning specialist. And so if you want more of this good stuff, and to be honest, I want more of this good stuff. I was so thrilled that you said yes when I invited you, because I knew we were going to be inspired, because you, sir, are inspirational.
Well,
so thank you.
much.
Thank you for joining us on Live from NCCE. And thank all of you for tuning in. And those of you watching the recording, we'll be back in about a month with Matt Miller from Ditch That Textbook. So we're looking forward to that. But again, so appreciative of your time and your talent. And thank you for being on Live from NCCE, Dr. John.
Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful. Take care.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.